Hello, how are you?
Hello, I'm good. Yeah, it's been a pretty decent week. A little bit of housework, a lot of hours at work, and just this week at church, we joined a new community group, which,
Ooh,
yeah, we've been wanting to be in a community group. Our church is very focused on those, but it hadn't really fit in our schedule very well. It hadn't fit in all the things that we've got going on. So it finally did. We got connected and we had our first meeting last night, and man, it was great. Just good, solid conversation, good people. I'm just thrilled to be a part of it.
that's
So,
awesome.
yeah, exactly. So
That's
how are
super
you?
good. I am doing pretty well. This is our second week of school where we are back to school. And so we are jumping into the routine of theater and job for the kids and all of those kinds of things. And it's just been a fun transition. I always love this time of the year when suddenly there is structure again. It
Yes.
makes me feel warm and fuzzy. And so I just am thrilled.
I could not agree more, though I am still a week and a half out from that.
Whew.
My we don't start until September 3rd. So we've got
Ooh,
just a little bit longer to go.
well, you can make it.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's hoping. But, well, speaking of teenagers, that actually leads right into the thing I want to talk about today.
Ooh, what's that?
Well, here's the thing. You and I are at a unique place in our parenting. Raising teenagers is a very different thing than raising young children. And especially as my kids are now 20, 18, and 15. And as we're in various stages of launching our kids, it is very evident that they have to kind of own their own spiritual lives. Not that that hasn't always been true, but it is true to a greater extent than ever. And I want to talk about what it means for us to be in this stage of life and to allow our kids to kind of launch spiritually and for us to have influence, but not necessarily control.
Yeah, I love that phrase. Influence, but not necessarily control. That certainly captures a big chunk of how I feel with my kids being a little bit younger than yours. Mine are 14 and 16, soon here to be 15 and 17. And yeah, I am 100% with you. I don't get to tell them what to believe anymore. I don't get to tell them what to do anymore. For example, we had a worship night at church, and my son probably could have snuck in a few minutes late coming from work. He was like, "Yeah, I don't want to do that because worship is not his thing." I mean, he thinks Jesus is great, but it's just not his thing. And so
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh, okay." And I had to kind of pause and have the same reaction to I get to influence and not control. And what does that mean my role is has been my question in this moment for myself.
Yeah. Well, and also it raises all sorts of insecurities for me because I think, there are a lot of expectations on the evangelical Christian parent, right? If I were just to, off the
Mhm.
top of my head, list a few of these expectations, right? You're going to have your kids in church every week or
Mhm.
pretty consistently. You're going to get them involved in youth group, or before that, Awanas or whatever sort of like Christian
Kids ministry
education.
thing.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to pray with them every night. You're going to have a family Bible study. You're going to pray for them consistently. You're going to pray with them, especially as big issues and things come up. You're going to teach them about the Bible and you're going to read the Bible together. These are all this like big umbrella expectations. And I have to say, I have not always done all of those things well. In fact, some of them I've done consistently poorly. So when my kids are getting to this point where I just only ever have influence, then I start going, man, did I do enough? And are they going to choose to follow Christ on their own? And in what form is that going to be? And am I going to be happy with that? And all of this, like, yeah, I'm watching their choices, but I'm also reflecting on myself as I watch what they do.
Absolutely. You talk about the insecurity that comes up from knowing you didn't do the Christian things. And I'm right there with you. I don't know that I did the best job in the world of those things. Family devotions was kind of a spotty experience for us. We would do it for a while and then not do it for a longer while and then do it for a little while and then not do it
Yes.
for a longer while. And as I look back, I would like to have prayed more with my kids. But
Yeah.
this raises the question for me, as you have been forming your kids' spiritual lives, what were you doing? Like, what were the things you were intentional about?
So one of the things that I was absolutely intentional about was separating their Christian walk from any sense of guilt or shame.
Mm,
I did not want to equate following Jesus with shame and ought and guilt. I wanted it to be free, inviting, good, exciting, relational, healthy. So that actually left me in a quandary because I didn't want to militarize anything, right? I didn't want to, every night at 7:00, we're going to sit around for family devotional. I don't care if you like it. This is the right thing to do. And I didn't want to do that. But it left me in some ways a little bit rudderless because all I knew was I didn't want guilt and shame, but I didn't know how to help my kids engage with God effectively without guilt and shame. How do you do the spiritual disciplines, the consistent thing, without creating a sense of ought and a sense of guilt and shame? And so I think that's the balance I was always trying to wrestle with, was making Christianity inviting and exciting, showing them the importance of it, but not making it a list of rules that we had to follow.
yeah, absolutely. My drivers were very similar. I didn't want any kind of guilt or shame. And I have been intrigued at the little spiritual people who showed up who don't have guilt or shame because I'm like, oh, that's not who I thought was going to show up without those things. Okay, interesting. Um, like I just, my kids bring their whole selves into their relationship with God and find it
Yeah.
confusing that someone else wouldn't, including the messy bits that I'm like, maybe you should just try to perform a little more. Um, and you know,
Yeah.
but you have me thinking. It's funny. I don't know because I was the same way. I didn't know what to infuse relating to God with if it was not driven by or anchored by guilt and shame into these practices. But as you were describing it, I was reminded of one of the principles. Do you remember? I think her name is Angela Duckworth. It's a book called Grit. Do you remember this?
Okay. Yes. I don't think I read it, but I am familiar with it.
It was very popular for a while, and it's a wonderful book. And if I recall correctly, one of the things she actually talked about was we often mess up pedagogy by trying to instill habits first, assuming that habits will eventually lead to interest and passion.
Mm.
And her argument was flip that. Instill interest and passion, and the habits will to some degree take care of themselves because interested and passionate people figure out habits.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So this is the general philosophy that lived in the back of my mind and which is a nebulous thing. How do you foster passion and interest. But I was having a conversation just a couple weeks ago with my daughter and talking about spiritual habits and the importance of spiritual habits, but only as they relate to opportunity to deepen relationship. That is the point of spiritual habits. And so she was talking about some of the spiritual habits she wants to grow in and develop even further. And I said, yes, that's all good. But remember, this is all in service of relationship. And she kind of looked at me and she's like, yeah, of course it is. That's what you guys have been teaching me my whole life. I said, well, yes, I suppose that's true. I think one of the things I regret is that we did not instill, a consistency when it comes to the spiritual disciplines. And she said, yeah, but if you had, I am certain I would have seen Christianity as a cult. She's like, practices without relationship mean nothing. And you guys emphasized relationship, and that's where I'm at. And now I'm adding the practices and it seems natural. And I mean, wow, thank God. Like, he's intervened. He has done some work in my kids' life, despite what I think is kind of a spotty record on my part. But I'm thrilled that she saw relationship first and practices second.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that that's the route that we're going. I find the same thing with my kids. My son is 16, and I don't know how consistently he, quote unquote, has a quiet time. But I do know that the other day when I asked him about prayer, he's like, I talk to God about everything. I, I asked him, hey, should we pray more together? Like, would you be interested in that? He's like, he kind of got this hesitant look in his eyes. And I think the essence of it was that he has a level of transparency with Jesus that is not possible with everybody else, and isn't sure what to do if somebody else is there. It's going to feel inauthentic because of how authentic it normally is.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, he has recently, 3 different nights in the last 3 weeks. One night he read all of Genesis, and then another night he read all of Exodus, and then another night he read all of Leviticus, which was last night. So
Wow.
yeah. So I don't know what that means.
Right.
Other than I desperately want him to read like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but whatever.
Again, but that's where we don't get the control. Right. And, so if he were picking up Revelation and you were going, wow, I don't know if you had start there. Well, at least it's the Bible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the questions he's asking may not be the questions I want him to ask. And this is where I am struck, because in my coaching practice, I believe that the questions that the client is asking are the most important questions by default. And so I don't ask questions. I don't offer solutions or answers or whatever. I ask questions that build on what they want to focus on. And in so many ways, I think this is where I'm at in coaching and spiritually forming my kids. I am constantly like, oh, that's not how I think it should be done. Who cares how I think it should be done? Like, I get input, but it's their journey, and I need to respect that and trust that it matches whatever's going on in their hearts and minds in this moment.
Yeah, which is great if you see actual progress or things going on. But also, teenagers are not always forthcoming about their own personal lives and what they're thinking about and all of that. And so I know that there have been periods of times with at least one of my kids at any given time that they're not talking about spiritual things, and they're not talking about their faith, and they're not talking about what they're reading or how their prayer life is. And maybe that means that there's nothing happening, in which case, again, how do you foster and encourage a relationship with God, knowing that you can't make it happen for them?
I think that's a great question. Some of the answers that I've wrestled with over the years are be authentically doing these things myself. Right? Like, I don't want to encourage my kids to spend time with Jesus if I'm not. That sounds super fake to me. somewhere deep in my heart, I believe that if I have a vibrant relationship with Jesus, that will spill over and be attractive.
I think you're exactly right. And because it's not just that they're going to see that and want to emulate it, because we know that sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But if that is genuinely where you are and you have this vibrant relationship with God, you're going to talk about it. It's just part of your conversation. Like, yeah, this morning in my prayer time, I really just felt God was saying this, or I read this the other day and it was really exciting. And whatever it is, it's all going to just spill out. And it's just another prompting, if you will, another visible sign of what this could look like for them that I think is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, what else are your answers to this question? Like, as you've tried to influence without controlling, what does that look like in your relationship with your kids?
Yeah, I think just looking for natural opportunities to ask how things are. I don't want to get too personal with my kids' lives, so I'm trying to use an example, but it just looking for those opportunities where it's supernatural to just say, so, as you're looking at your life and where you want to be and what the next steps look like where does God fit into that mix? Where does church fit into that mix? And how are you feeling in your relationship with God? Again, without it being awkward or forced or something, but just tying it naturally to the other steps of development that they're processing and allowing you into anyway, right? Like my oldest son is really into developing his career right now, and he's doing a great job. He's in a great apprenticeship and learning a lot. And so as we talk about him and saving up for the different things and getting ready to move out onto his own at some point, all of that is a launching point for me to say, okay, and so how do you envision yourself connecting with God or finding a good church or whatever it is if you move out of the area and all of that? So yeah, just looking for the opportunities to just ask.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Ask, and then for me, the other piece of this has been listen, and you have to stride this kind of interesting balance of being the parent now doesn't mean I know everything, but it does mean I have the emotional maturity to not be reactive. And so, with both of my kids, I've had spiritual conversations where they come into the conversation in this sort of like debatey, sort of like, I'm going to argue with you on this thing sort of moment. And I have failed in this a host of times. Like there was one moment where I was like, please do not come at me with stuff that you have not spent 3 seconds thinking about. Like I just have no, like I said that, except probably more rudely than that. And, my son in this moment happened to be the one who was like, Dad, that hurt my feelings because this is something I've thought about. And I apologized and we moved on and whatever. And it was a great call. But, instead of being right, doing the conversation right has to be, I think, a big part of parenting in this situation.
Yeah, I agree. And then I think also being vulnerable ourselves to talk about where we have gotten it wrong or where we have felt a sense of guilt or shame or whatever. And to say, hey, this is not what I want for you. This has been part of my spiritual journey of feeling like I'll go through a cycle of I should pray more and I don't. And so then I feel guilty and then I feel like God is mad at me, which keeps me from praying more. And then it just compounds and on it goes. Meanwhile, God is just standing there going, hello, can we just have a relationship? I'm really not as mad as you think I am. And so just being able to share that and other vulnerabilities with my kids and be able to say, just pray from where you are. Just take wherever you are and take it into relationship with God and encourage this sort of openness with God that doesn't elevate me to a position of like, I've got it all figured out and let me teach you. It's saying, even when you don't have it all figured out, you can be in relationship with God, and that is still a good thing.
Absolutely. And part of that for me is a willingness to experiment in life and experiment knowing that they're doing it with Jesus. So there are several times I have run into friends that either of my kids have had that, like, man, I'm not sure that's the best friend to have, or
Right.
whatever the situation is. And I'm thinking, or, they're going to go watch this movie, or they have friends over from church. And I realize, oh, we've let our kids watch a lot of things that maybe we need to check with their parents before they watch with their friends.
Right. That's the other evangelical expectation, right? No R-rated movies.
Yeah.
Some families, not even PG-13.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, dear. Please do not burst out into that first refrain from Hamilton, with your church friends. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And having to acknowledge that I've parented in a fairly non-conservative way, believing that what I want is for my kids to talk to me about what they're experiencing. So I want them to experience as much stuff as possible before they go out the door. And
age appropriate, of course.
Age appropriate. Absolutely. I'm thinking in terms of, like, I think I shared this on the podcast a couple months ago. My daughter twice had the conversation with me, Dad, what do you think about me listening to Taylor Swift? I said, well, what do you think about you listening to Taylor Swift? Why are we having this conversation? And one of the times she decided, I'm totally okay with that. Another time she was like, I'm not sure that that's really helping me.
There's an individuality to that answer as well. Like I remember my oldest son could handle certain scary things or intense things on TV that we shielded my daughter from for a lot longer, because she just had a more sensitive heart. I'm not saying my oldest son is insensitive. I'm just saying
insensitive. That's what we're saying.
Okay. Yeah. There you go. That's what Josh from Missouri is saying. Your dad loves you. But
as
anyway,
long as you're the one who brings him coffee.
Exactly. Anyway, there's some individuality to that answer, right? I think for one of my kids, listening to Taylor Swift might be perfectly appropriate, and there's nothing really going on in their head or their heart over that. But maybe for another, it really sends them for a loop, and it really affects them negatively. Well, then that matters.
Well, and even, the same kid at different times might have different answers.
Yeah.
And again, this is where my rules-driven, shame-driven self wants there to be an absolute right answer, when maybe the right answer is you have the freedom to decide this, and God's grace and love for you creates a safe space for you to answer it for yourself. And whatever you do, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. That freedom is really hard, though. It's really hard to give your kids that latitude.
Mm-hmm.
You just want such good things for them. You want them to make good choices. You want them to follow Jesus, and you just feel so tempted to step in and say, therefore you must do X or whatever it is.
Yeah. And at least for me, I feel like I'm still in it.
Well, to some extent, I think we're always going to be in it, because hopefully these are conversations that happen throughout our kids' lives. And as they grow and start raising their own families and all of these other things, I hope they're always open to receiving that spiritual influence.
Yeah. No, I think about this all the time. One driver for me to want to spiritually grow is that I want to be far enough along in my spiritual journey that my kids still want to come to me with questions.
Right. Yeah.
And are interested in sharing.
Well, and I want my answers, again, not to be shame-based. I never want my response to them to be, well, then you ought, or, well, you didn't do this, and so therefore. I want them to trust that my answer is going to be safe, that it's going to have their best interests at heart, and that I'm going to encourage them to find answers in partnership with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a piece of this, right? Is believing that the Holy Spirit is present means that I can safely trust them to try. Not because the presence of the Holy Spirit means that they're guaranteed to get everything right, but it certainly means that the Holy Spirit is at least as present to be corrective when necessary as I'll ever be.
Yeah. I don't know if you have an answer to this question, but as you've had spiritual conversations with your kids, are there things that you have just learned from them, or because of the conversation with them, you have seen the world or God in a different light?
Yeah, I think for me, with both of my kids, as profoundly different as they are, like we said before, one of the goals that I've had in parenting my kids through the spiritual journey of these early stages of their lives is to be not shame based, not to be guilt driven. And so I'm always intrigued by what therefore comes up in their spiritual lives. Like there is a clear sense, and I love it, but it is very different for me. And it's funny, I suspect it's probably not as different for my wife, because I'm not sure she ever had the level of shame or guilt that I grew up with. But there is this clear sense that we talked about before of my whole self is coming to God. And so this brings a level of confidence that I'm still working to square with. Can you be confident and humble at the same time? Because I know humility is important, but I think that I cultivated in myself. Many people who are like me found themselves believing that humility was really this shame driven downtroddenness.
Mm,
Whereas I think authentic humility probably is a slower growing plant. I think that humility becomes this process of pruning back what has grown in the person's sort of character over time. But I think that if developing humility is this act of pruning oneself, the first step, sort of like we were talking about before, is this idea of just letting myself develop in any which way.
mm,
And so that might mean having some wonky theological beliefs. It might mean having some sort of wonky ways of looking at church or other people, or it might mean loving Jesus in the moment. And that, like you were saying kind of earlier, with there not being a lot of habits undergirding that, kind of spiritual disciplines undergirding that yet. Um, I don't know if any of that really answered the question, but those are the things that kind of come to mind.
yeah. As I hear you talk about that, I am recognizing the fact that this is a point in time narrative. This is,
Mm,
we're naming our kids as ages. And by the time somebody listens to this a couple of years from now, our kids will be a very different age.
yep.
And they will be in a very different place spiritually. And so whatever wonky theological beliefs they might develop at the age of 16 is not necessarily what they're going to hold at the age of 20. And
Mm-hmm.
whatever lack of spiritual disciplines they might have at 14 is not necessarily where they're going to be at 25. And so it's okay for them to be in process. And I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about with the humility piece. It is okay to be in process. And there isn't this sense of obligation or fear that you're doing it wrong or guilt that you're not measuring up or whatever. It's just they seem to feel a very open sense of it's okay to be in process.
And that results in a what at least appears from the outside to be a lack of striving, um,
Yeah.
which makes great sense. I mean, even my pastor on Sunday, one of the main points he made about the text he was preaching on was that we try so hard to grow in the direction we want to grow ourselves, but that's not how growth works. Growth is
Yeah.
a natural and organic thing that happens the way it's going to happen. And that's fine.
It is. And, in terms of the spiritual disciplines that really do foster growth, like I believe in consistent prayer, Bible reading,
Absolutely.
fasting, solitude, all of these different things. But to some extent, it may be early adulthood where it's most natural to develop those skills for oneself. And
Absolutely.
the absence of them prior to that probably doesn't actually mean anything.
Yeah, I think you're very likely right. I think when I think about when do we start expecting kids to have analogous habits in other areas of their lives, it's we're only at the beginning of that phase.
Yeah.
We're just kind of getting to the point where we're like, okay, you should be able to do this on your own now. And so I think you're right. I think spiritual habits will come, hopefully, over time.
Yeah. And I think, especially as they own their faith even more, they really develop this sense of true relationship with God. Not just like I've been taught some things by the church or by my parents or whatever about God, but a genuine sense of relationship with God. And then a curiosity that says, now, how do I develop this? How do I grow in
Mm,
this? And using that curiosity as a springboard into the spiritual disciplines, not out of, again, guilt, obligation, whatever, but out of curiosity and interest and relational passion.
yeah, exactly. I think that there is just this invitation to a lifelong journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember thinking as a kid, and maybe this is the biggest thing for me. I remember believing that adults were sort of frozen in the developmental state that they got to at, I don't know, whatever, 21 or something. Um, right? Like, I didn't think adults could grow or mature.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and so I remember feeling this like extreme urgency to like hurry up and get there because wherever, once I got to that age, however far I'd gotten, that was all I got. I think maybe this is another piece of it. Not only is there a sense of no guilt and no shame, but I think our kids know that we're in process and that affords them the opportunity to know that at 40 something, they'll be in process too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
I hope
correct.
so. Yeah, I hope so. I want nothing more for them than to know that they can keep growing.
Hmm. That's it.
Hmm. Well, thanks for this conversation. It was actually really encouraging to me because, like I said, there's a lot of guilt and shame in parenting. And then when you put the weight of a future relationship with God on the line, and then you start to really heap on your own guilt and shame about, I woulda, shoulda, coulda, woulda, shoulda, coulda. How does
All
it?
of them. Woulda,
Okay.
shoulda, coulda.
Yeah. So all of those things. So I appreciate this conversation. It's actually been really encouraging, and I hope it is encouraging to our audience as well. If you are a parent, regardless of the stage of parenting that you're in, what are your goals for your children? Above all, what guides your motives and what guides your approach to introducing your kids to Jesus? I would love to hear about that and love to encourage one another with those thoughts. Well, Josh from Missouri, we have finished our Summer in the Psalm series, and
Yes.
now our thoughts come from other areas of life. So, outside of the Psalms, what have you been thinking about?
My thought today comes from no, wait. Um,
Old habits die hard.
yeah, they really do. No, my thought today comes from the book that I'm currently reading, which is Jesus Through Medieval Eyes by Grace Hammond. Have you read this?
No, I actually haven't heard it.
So
Heard of it.
it is an introduction to some of the main metaphors that the medieval church used in processing who Jesus was. And her basic argument is if we engage with people from a different time and place, it will help us see Jesus more clearly because it will help us see our own blind spots a little bit more obviously. But what I actually really loved was the way in which a 21st century woman's perspective on both our 21st century context and the medieval context allowed me to see both my own context and the medieval context differently. So I feel like it got to be this three-way conversation between me, Dr. Hammond, and the medieval artists and painters and poets that she was talking about. One of the things she was talking about was this idea of propriety and how in the medieval era, there was this sense that it was the men who needed to be told to be more appropriate. And so guys were frequently, like there is actual writing on guys being told, hey, your jacket is too short. You're showing off too much of your hose and it's not appropriate. And she records that her professor says in response to this, because there's this sort of quote, because obviously Jesus values propriety. And the professor says, now, where on earth would they get this idea that Jesus values propriety? And as a 21st century woman raised in evangelicalism, her response was, yeah, no, I was taught that Jesus values propriety a lot.
Yeah.
Because I was told to measure my skirt to make sure that it was like, or my shorts that were, make sure they were down to the tips of my fingers and all these sorts of things. And it just was fascinating to hear this sort of interplay between her perspective, my perspective, the medieval perspective. I have found it to be a book that invites rich conversation. And I'm just loving it.
Wow. Yeah, that must be a really good book. I'm very
so good.
Interested. Huh.
So, yeah. So, what about you? What have you been thinking about?
Well, I cannot get last week's conversation out of my head. We really went to town on this idea of post-mortem opportunity. Can you get saved after you die? And I thought it was a really good conversation, but at so many turns, I thought to myself, man, I am not as knowledgeable on this as I want to be. And there are so many people that have put some thought into this that I'd like to go and read some of those guys and get oriented in the conversation and then try again. Because even some of the things that we were trying to struggle for words around, there are actual existing terms for these things, right? And so I would like to familiarize myself with the conversation a little bit better. And then I would love to re-engage. So I don't know what you think about trying again, but I don't know about trying again. I thought it was a good episode, but I want to have another round of that conversation with some other seats at the table.
I think that's a great idea. I have actually had this in mind as well. I consistently in that conversation felt like I was running up against my own lack of information about what deeper and wiser thinkers than I have said about these things.
Yeah. So before our episode today, I pulled off the shelf like 5 different books. I have 5 different systematic theologies sitting right in front of me that I intend to read read the particular sections of, in order to prep for this conversation. So I mean, this is Evangelical Theology by Michael Bird, one of my favorite writers. Norman Geisler's Systematic Theology. That's a very Baptist interpretation. Christian Theology by Millard Erickson. Systematic Theology by Wayne Grudem. And Amos Young's Systematic Theology, Renewing Christian Theology. I want to just flip through and see what these guys have to say and get reacquainted.
Yeah, I'm in the same way. As I look over at my shelf, I have some similar and some different titles I would love to dig into. I also have Erickson and Bird and would love to know what they both say. I also have Grudem, and again, would love to know what he has to say. Then there's an accompanying volume to Grudem. I actually don't have it in front of me, but I think it's called Historical Theology, and I have a copy of it in the other room. And it walks through what significant church thinkers have thought historically. And so I'm really curious to throw that in the mix. And then again, on the historical side of things, I'm curious to add, I have a copy of Calvin's Systematic, the Institutes of Christian Religion. Is that what it's called? And
that's
I'm
how I
curious to
remember
think what Calvin has to say, because he often is the guy who has thought about things pastorally as well as intellectually in some ways that I find fascinating.
Yeah, that is really, really true. I think you're exactly right. Well, wow, this will make for a rich conversation if we can bring all of these different thinkers to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. So next week, get ready. Anybody who thought, yeah, I listened to that last conversation and it wasn't very good. That's what we thought too, but we're going at it again.
Okay. All right. I am looking forward to trying again.
All right. Well, speaking of other things that I know you've been looking forward to, can you believe it is already time for another Which Josh question?
I can hardly believe it. I'm stoked.
And yet here I am, ready to give it to you. Here it is.
Okay.
Which Josh was the only guy in his kindergarten class?
Oh, hey, that's me. I was the only guy, not only in my kindergarten class, but kindergarten, first and half of second grade. Only guy.
Whew.
Yeah.
How big was this class?
I don't know. I was a little kid.
But I mean, like 5 or like 20?
No. Yeah, more like 20. Well, probably 12 to 15.
Okay.
I think this school had just opened when I started in kindergarten there. It was a private school. And I think K through 8, the first year I was there, they only had 80 students. But, so often with these starts, the kindergarten class is much, much larger than the other classes because those kids are already established in other schools. So, the kindergarten class is a relatively decent size, and then the school grows as that class moves up and through. And so that was my experience. By the time I finished up 8th grade, whatever that is. Some people call it a graduation. By the time I finished 8th grade, I think we had like 350 students in the school. So very, very different.
That's awesome. Well, you survived. And
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
I think we're just both completely lost on what that means in life.
It really, yeah. I've tried to draw some connection and say that's therefore whatever. I don't know. It just was. It's a little factoid. There, we did it. Now you know.
Next week, more books, more factoids, more On the Phone with Josh. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. I'll talk to you then.
Okay, bye.